Our next speaker for this second keynote session is Lauren Klein. And Lauren is a Winship Distinguished Research Professor and Associate Professor in the Department of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia in the US. She's also the director of the Digital Humanities Lab that represent work that employ a humanistic approach to data, data science, and data's history. Before moving to Emory, Lauren worked at the School of Literature, Media and Communication at Georgia Tech, and in 2017 she was named one of the rising stars in digital humanities by Inside Higher Ed. In her research, Lauren brings together computational and critical methods in order to explore issues of gender, race and justice, both as they emerge in early American history and as they endure in the present. Her theorization of the impact of these methods brings ideas from feminist theory, Black studies, and archival theory into disciplinary conversation about how to design more just and equitable data systems. For this conference, we are particularly inspired by Lauren's recent book, Data Feminism, co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio and published in 2020 at MIT Press. The book is very precise in outlining how data never speak for themselves, and it explains, for example, how the concept of invisible labor can be useful to expose the significant human efforts that are indeed required by our automated systems. For today, Lauren will give a talk with the title Data Feminism in Action, and welcome so much.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Good, thank you. It's really, really nice to be here, not the least because this is maybe the second time ever I've presented about this work actually in person, and it's certainly the most vertical setting in which I've presented this today. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about this book, Data Feminism, which outlines a set of principles for doing more just and equitable data science. And I should say, as a caveat, or maybe just by way of introduction, we wrote this book for a general audience. It was really intended to sort of be easily transformed into action. And while it wasn't directed in particular in the area of smart cities, I'm hoping that some of the examples, which I think actually some of them may be familiar to you because they do have to do with questions of cities and urbanism. But I'm hoping that one of the things that you'll take away is how sort of deep and historicized types of theories, including but not limited to feminism, really can be operationalized in the work that we do, that it's not impossible and is in fact quite doable to take the thinking that we do in our scholarship and apply it, sort of put it into action in the world. So, here's my clicker. The one thing I'll just say before getting started, the one more thing, is that this is co-authored work with Catherine D'Ignazio. You can see her up there. She actually is probably the better person to be speaking here, but she is not conveniently in Sweden at the moment. She's an assistant professor of urban science and planning at MIT. And then the one last thing that I'll say before getting started is if you do want to read more about the book, it's available open access via this URL over there. So I'll just jump right in. We have a really simple motivating premise for the book, which is that in the world today, data is a tremendous form of power. You can think of the multiple ways, maybe the many ways in which data science has been used for tremendous benefit, specifically to advance medical discovery, to document the effects of climate change. I could come up with a significant list, but it's also resulted in significant harm. So you could think about how in the Netherlands, an algorithm incorrectly flagged 26,000 families, I believe, for suspected social benefits fraud. This followed on the heels of the fiasco with the A-levels in the UK. There's the infamous example of how Amazon decided to train a resume screening system in order to identify the candidates that were worth actually speaking to, being spoken to by humans. But it turned out that because they trained the resume screening system on existing Amazon employees, it developed a preference for only male employees and only white employees, the majority of whom have been working already at Amazon. every time I get up here and I give a talk about this type of work, it's sort of, I think about the examples that pop into my head or that might be relevant for a particular audience. And then I also think like I could really just stand here for an entire half hour and continue to atomize for you all of the ways in which these data-driven systems have done serious harm. But the main point that I want to make is this, which is that data are indeed incredibly powerful, but that power is currently wielded unequally. This we know, right? This power is wielded by a small and homogenous group of corporations and other well-resourced institutions, including educational institutions, I should say. They, and sometimes we, are the ones who have the resources to design and deploy these data systems, and usually at the expense of everyone else. And this is actually where feminism enters in. And what we explain in the book is how feminism and intersectional feminism has been focused on precisely this issue, on imbalances of power and the structural forces that cause them. This has been the project of feminism for many, many, many years. And so if you wanted to put this in slightly more technical terms, you know, right now everyone is talking about the brittleness of AI systems, by which they mean systems that are optimized for certain types of situations and not others, or certain groups of people and not others. But the basic idea that systems, social systems, any systems, are optimized for certain groups and not others, this is not at all news to feminists, right? Or the sort of current panic over data bias, you know, that we're seeing in industry right now, you know, oh my gosh, the training data, it's so biased, what do we do, right? The idea that biases are fundamentally sort of baked into not just the scientific record, but the cultural record writ large. This obviously has been a topic of, I would say, you know, feminist STS scholarship for decades, but really much of the humanities and the social sciences. I'm going to get actually a little bit deeper into the argument that we make in the book about why data science really needs feminism, but I think it's important to do some basic level setting. You know, I've been listening to the talk so far, and I know that we're going to hear another talk on the topic of feminism right after mine. And so I expect that there is sort of at least a baseline working knowledge of the types of feminisms that are out there in the world. But I think it's really important to do some level setting about what I mean, what Catherine and I mean when we say feminism in the book. And I mentioned before, this was a book that was written for a general audience. So we start with a really basic definition. We say that feminism at its core entails a belief in equality. Equality for all genders, so this includes both cis and trans women, as well as men and non-binary folks. But if you take a look around you, you realize this goal of equality has by no means been realized in the world. And so feminism also necessarily entails organized activity on behalf of women and non-binary folks to make this goal of equality the reality. And I'll talk a little bit more about what this organized activity should entail in a minute, because I think it's important to recognize that not all activity on behalf of gender equality has the same impact. And especially when we see these sort of like narrowly focused interventions aimed at elevating certain powerful women to the ranks of already powerful men. These types of actions can actually result in significant harm. And I was thinking, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot because one of the things that's been in the news in the past week, at least in the US, is Sheryl Sandberg leaving Facebook, which has prompted this conversation about like, what does it mean that we have this one woman in power? And the answer is, in my opinion, it doesn't mean very much. In any case, I want to be sure just to introduce the third definition of feminism that we mobilize in the book, which has to do with the set of theories and ideas. These theories, they began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender, but really, you know, the past, 40 years of scholarship, the persistent political reality, these things have brought many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include questions of race, questions of class, questions of colonialism, sexual orientation, ability, and so on. So this sort of brings me back around, or rather up to the idea of intersectional feminism. And in our view, and this is something that we say in the book, feminism, if you're going to be talking about feminism in the year 2022 or 2018-19 when we were writing the book, feminism must be understood as intersectional. Again, most of you, I'm assuming, are familiar, at least have a sort of working definition of this term. It comes to us from the work of women of color feminists and from Black feminists in particular. But what feminism gains more broadly from, you can think of concepts like the Combahee River Collective's formulation of interlocking systems of oppression, Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality, someone like Patricia Hill Collins has this idea of the matrix of domination. Each of these formulations are frameworks that can structure critiques of power. So these are the reasons why certain people, including but not limited to women, might experience oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other. So I want to just sort of come back around to this question of what feminist activism should properly entail, because I think this is an important one. And our view, and this is something that we say in the book, is that feminist action must intervene into issues of power. So if gender justice is to be achieved, it will only be achieved together with racial justice, with economic justice, with disability justice, and so on. And these types of movements, they need to be led with people with the most direct experience with these issues of injustice in working in coalition with everyone else. So to come back around to the argument that we make in the book, the basic one is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help this unequal balance of power that we see playing out every day in these data systems. It can help it be challenged and ideally rebalanced and changed. And so what we do in the book is use the teachings of intersectional feminism, I should say sort of supplemented by other ideas from feminist activism and critical thought, in order to arrive at these 7 principles that you can see for doing more ethical and equitable data science. So they're examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And I said before, our goal was really to operationalize feminism, to really provide a clear set of principles or guidelines for people who are currently working with data, both in academia and in industry, for people who want to work with data, including students, or for people who want to refuse to work with data for political or ideological reasons. And in the book, we have one chapter, that's sort of the structure of the book. We have one chapter on each principle, and we illustrate some of the thinking behind it through just a lot of examples. And I'm not actually, you're probably relieved, going to go through each of the chapters in order in the book today. I've just sort of pulled out a couple of examples that I think bring together some of these principles and illustrate what I mean about being able to operationalize these theories. And I think if I had a takeaway for this particular setting, it's sort of this kind of thinking. This is the kind of thinking that I would like to see enacted in a smart cities context. So I'm going to start with a project that we talk about really early on in the book, and I really talk about pretty much every time I pull out examples that I want to talk about in a public setting, because it's so important. This is a project which fundamentally takes on this question of power and really interrogates it. It's called The Library of Missing Data Sets. It's by the artist and educator Mimi Onuoha, and it's actually an artwork. It's displayed in 2 ways. So the first is just as a GitHub repository. That's what you see in the screenshot up here. Oh, where's my pointer? Over there. You can actually Google it. You can read it now. And if you go to the website, what you will find is a list of data sets that you expect to exist because they address issues of really intense social need, but because of various forces and factors, they don't actually exist in real life. So you see titles like trans people killed or injured and instances of hate crime, right? This is not something that has been comprehensively studied or documented in the United States. People excluded from public housing because of criminal records. This is a sort of a US specific type of data set, but it has to do with the sort of misalignment of 2 social policies that sort of converge in a way in which the people who are most in need of public assistance for housing are the very same people who are denied that benefit. I think, this artwork, obviously, it predates COVID, but I think now we all deeply understand the importance and the significance of these types of missing data sets. So the second way to encounter this artwork, it's as a physical installation, and that's the file cabinet that you see up here on the left. So the idea is that you walk into a gallery space, you encounter this file cabinet, it's open, the file folders are there, you can tab through them as you would any other file folder. They're labeled with the names of these missing data sets. You see one that seems interesting or important, and you go to open it up, and then it turns out that the folder is missing. Or rather, the data set is missing, the folder is empty. And the point that Onwoha is trying to make in this piece with these empty file folders and the like, these data sets, they're missing for a reason. And this reason has to do with this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So this imbalance of power is what determines what data are collected and what data are not. And I think importantly for us, this also determines what research can be conducted and what research cannot. So again, who tends to have the ability to authorize the collection of data sets? It's governments, corporations, well-resourced educational institutions. And generally speaking, minoritized groups do not have the same power to authorize the collection of these data sets. So this is why a feminist approach to data science needs to begin with an analysis of power. And I would say the same holds, for smart cities research as well, right? Because far too often the data sets that we can easily access or even not so easily access, and then in turn the questions that they prompt, those have already been overdetermined by this imbalance of power in the world. So a really profound instance of missing data sets has to do with this issue of feminicide. Feminicides, these are gender-related killings of women and girls, so they include both cis and trans women. They take place all around the world. And one of the things that we do in the book is talk to one woman who has sort of identified and vowed to redress this issue of missing data by collecting the data herself. This woman's name is Maria Salguero. She's a Mexican citizen. And since, I believe, 2015, she's been working multiple hours a day to collect and compile a data set of women who have been killed in Mexico on the basis usually of media reports. She's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs. And ironically, she's been called in to testify to the Mexican Congress about the very same laws that Congress has implemented, but failed to enforce because they haven't sponsored or funded the collection of data on this same issue. So this is a form of what might be called feminist counter data. So this is activist data collection that steps in when the state or other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And it represents one way, and not an easy way, but a way that has sort of a slower on-ramp. It's one way to use data to challenge power. And I should caveat that by saying that not all issues that we encounter can be solved by collecting more data, right? There are some situations, and actually many situations, for which collecting more data about a particular issue or a particular population can expose that population to additional harm. So we need to think very carefully before we just sort of say, like, now everyone go forth and collect counter data, right? It's very situational, it's very contextual. And I did want to sort of caveat that. But I also wanted to just give a quick shout out to Catherine's new work with the Data Against Feminicide project, which is what she's undertaken since writing the Data Feminism book. And what she's doing is working to bring together activists from across Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean and some places beyond, who are all working on the issue of feminicide. She's building tools, as you can see here, but she's also building community. And one of the things that Catherine is trying to take seriously in this work is this commitment to embracing pluralism, to listening and learning from the activists and what they say they need, whether this is tools or community or support, or in certain cases, deciding not to build a tool in order to automate this process, which also has a role of sort of honoring and testifying to the loss that has taken place. But this idea of embracing pluralism by meaning sort of inviting many and multiple people to the design table. This actually, it comes from another principle that we outline in the book. And I'm going to just turn to another example of it now. So this is a project that may be familiar to this audience. It's a project undertaken by the San Francisco-based Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. And it's another pretty long-standing project. It's been going on since 2013. They've been working with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis in the Bay Area. Bay Area being the sort of location of Silicon Valley, all these highly paid tech workers. They have come into this area which actually has very restrictive zoning laws. There's not enough housing. The landlords have realized that if they can get pretty much anyone who does not work in Silicon Valley out of these houses, they can get the tech workers in to their immense personal profit. In any case, what you're looking at on the map more specifically, each of these red dots indicates a place where a person or a family was evicted from their home. And the blue dots indicates places where the AEMP, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, has interviewed one of the people who was evicted from that place. And if you click on one of the little blue dots, you can bring up a video interview with these residents. And one of the things that we do in the book is contrast the work of the map you were just looking at with this project. This is called the Eviction Lab. This is based at Princeton University. And what their goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And I should say, you know, I'm about to sort of launch into a critique of their methods, but I should just say sort of baseline, like this is actually a really valuable project. It has produced a lot of really informative papers, but it's wildly different in terms of process. And I think this contrast between the work that the AEMP does and the work that the Eviction Lab does actually teaches us a little bit about our own assumptions about what we think data should do and how we value certain types of data work and not others. So if you're looking at this map, you might immediately think, like, I think I'm looking at bigger data, right? I'm certainly looking at a broader expanse of space. This project tells me about the entire country, you know, not just one particular city, you know, up there on the left corner. You also might look at it and think, like, I think it's a little bit more scholarly or rigorous, right? You know, they're not just using Google Maps, they're using like Mapbox or whatever. I think, you know, maybe it's has a little bit more research behind it or whatever assumption you might have. But one of the really interesting things that's come out over the course of these two projects coming up at the same time, and actually in large part due to scholarship and research done by the AEMP itself, is that the national real estate databases that are used for the data for this larger map, they significantly undercount evictions. And again, you can think just for a minute like why this might be true. First of all, like real estate industry not incentivized to count any more evictions than they have to. And then the other thing you can think about is all of the ways in which you can be forcibly removed from your home that do not take the form of an official eviction notice, right? Ranging from, you know, like raising the rent a lot to inhospitable interactions with your landlord to not fixing a leak in the ceiling or what have you. These are not officially recorded as evictions and therefore don't enter the data set, but certainly are ways that have been deployed by landlords in order to get people to leave. And so one of the things that the AEMP has shown is that because they work with community groups, so the places where people go in the neighborhood and they say like, help me, this is happening to me, what do I do? And they've developed methods for compiling, cataloging, and organizing these data. They've actually developed and gathered more comprehensive, more accurate, admittedly messier, but certainly more contextualized data that documents a fuller extent of the problem at hand. And so this is another thing that is gained by embracing pluralism, by starting as a baseline with the belief that the things that people are experiencing and the things that people are telling you, these things are true. So I just have a little bit of editorializing about participatory processes, which again, I think sort of bears relevance for a lot of the projects that all of us in this room are seeking to do. You know, like, okay, fine, you're on board, you know, like you've convinced me it's time to embrace pluralistic design processes, but whose voices do we actually prioritize, right? This can actually be a really difficult question, and you can spend a lot of time asking yourself, what should I do? Practically speaking, I don't have enough time to talk to everyone. I can't even bring everyone all together. There's not enough room. Usually we're operating on academic timelines that are overdetermined by funding deadlines and publication deadlines and sometimes graduation deadlines and things like this. But one of the really nice things about feminism here, and in contrast, I would say, to a lot of other feminist ways of thinking where the answer is like, oh, it's complicated, is actually that feminism has a really clear answer to this. So if you follow the work of some really sort of, quite at this point established feminist thinkers like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, more recently people like Xiaowen Barzel, you would be taking power into account as you are designing your process for your project and centering the people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. So essentially making decisions and designing from the outside in. Okay, how am I doing for time, by the way? Okay, great. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about one more example. So the previous examples have really just been about power and people, sort of like people who have power and people who don't. But another major idea that comes from feminism relates to more conceptual structures of power, and more specifically binary structures that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. And feminist theory has helped to show how these binary distinctions, they're usually hiding a hierarchy with one group on the top and the other on the bottom. And what's been really interesting to me to realize, and this actually came to me sort of relatively late given the amount of time I've spent sitting with these ideas over the course of my career, is that once you see the hierarchy, you start to realize why the binary is there in the first place, why this insistence on the hard distinction. And the reason why it's there is to insist that the group on the bottom stays there and isn't able to sort of creep up into the top of the hierarchy, right? And so if you think of the distinction between the idea of man and woman, this is really the obvious reference point because it's a clear example both of a false binary and of an unequal hierarchy, right? There are more than two genders, and among them, no individual gender is intrinsically better than any other. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So you could think about the distinction between nature and culture, between teacher and student, or the one that I'm going to talk about very briefly, I promise, which is this artificial distinction between reason and emotion. And so, in the sort of Western context in which most of us have been trained up, we've taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. So if you think about like what are best practices, right? They often involve a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, like presenting just the facts. But the question remains, why are these our best practices, especially when research in that very same field, so the field of visualization research, has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. So we tend to think that minimalist charts are more truthful than they actually are. And I have a lot of citations on this, and if you want to talk about it later, we can. But what I want to think about just as my closing point here is the opposite. So visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. And that's what this next example and this last example is going to help us explore. So what you're looking at here, these are actually screenshots of an animated visualization. It's of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in a particular calendar year. And what happens is that each of the people killed by a gun in that year is represented as a single arc that is traced out on the screen one by one. They start out slow and then they get faster and faster until you can no longer read the information, like your brain cannot process it before the next one shows up. You start being able to identify each individual arc which corresponds to an individual life, but by the end they're all overlapping and intersecting with each other, so you can't pick any individual apart. And this is the point, right? It goes on for too long. There are too many points being plotted on this visualization because too many people are being killed by guns in the United States. And I'll just say it's sort of, methodologically, it's very statistically sound. It's based on like federal crime data, a model from the World Health Organization. But it was viewed with intense suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel things. And a feminist approach would say it's not a problem at all that it made us feel things. And actually, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. And so what you're able to do is, if you allow yourself to rebalance emotion and reason, is it really opens up our data communication toolbox to what really matters in a design process. So honoring the context of the data, listening to the experience that it represents, and ideally taking action to challenge the imbalances of power that we encounter in the world. So this is just the final point that I want to make before we turn over to the rest of the panel. And it's actually probably already obvious from these examples, but it's that data feminism really insists on an expanded definition of data science. So our data science isn't defined by the size of the data set or the credentials of the people undertaking the work, because these concerns are continually and have historically been used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work that makes a contribution that is socio-technical or humanistic instead of primarily methodological. But if we expand our definition of data science, then we can clearly see that work like this is happening all around us, right? And it's being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, by activists. And, you know, sure, like some of this work does look like data science. So there's a paper screenshotted up there, but then others of it looks like a mural on a wall or a talking sculpture. And I'll just conclude by saying this final point. You know, we have a lot of examples like this in the book, and each one of them was selected so that we could illustrate our points and really try to inspire our readers to action. Because, you know, I'll just go back to where I started today. Like, it is certainly true that data is at the source of so many harms that are experienced by so many people in the world today. But if we wield it intentionally and with care, and in collaboration with the communities that we're seeking to support, then we also think it can be part of the solution. So thanks so much for listening. Sorry for taking a little bit more time than I was promised, and I'm really eager to hear what happens next.